it's usually the women who catch on to this.
Mm-hmm.
Harriet Beecher Stowe copying Frances Trollope and Richard Hildreth and their novels and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah Parker Raymond also came here. She
Mm-hmm.
was from Concord, Massachusetts, Black, a
Mm-hmm.
friend of Frederick Douglass.
Mm-hmm.
She was lecturing against slavery
Mm-hmm.
in America and in England.
Mm-hmm.
And then she started studying medicine, and Mazzini wrote the letter for her
Mm-hmm.
to come and study for her MD, which she got at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital here, which was
Mm-hmm.
founded by Dante's Beatrice's father. And
Mm-hmm.
she got her MD
Mm-hmm.
before any woman could in
Mm-hmm.
1868.
Oh.
Wow.
And she's listed in the archives as Negra Americana.
Oh no.
And so we've been finding these stories, and
Mm-hmm.
we've been trying to use these stories to teach.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got this wonderful plaque that Daniel, whose ancestors were slaves of the Romanian nobles who are buried here,
Mm-hmm.
he wrote about Frederick Douglass
Mm-hmm.
visited here
Mm-hmm.
May the 11th,
Mm-hmm.
1877. And he
Mm-hmm.
chiseled those on the marble. And
Mm-hmm.
so the story, full circle,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a story of the oppressor being blind,
Mm-hmm.
just as in the sin of jealousy and envy.
Mm-hmm.
The jealous, envious person doesn't see his own criminality.
Yes.
How do we overcome that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I sort of feel at a loss
Mm-hmm.
because um, I'm sort of trying to figure out how to negotiate
Mm-hmm.
this. Well, 5,000 euro is
That's a
that is criminal.
Yeah.
yes.
But
I'm
I'm
so
being
sorry that happened.
well for them because it was
Yeah.
they are so used to accepting that things like this happen,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which I don't accept.
Mm-hmm.
We need this sense of justice within
Mm-hmm.
each of us.
It's a couple of thoughts in response to everything that you just told us. I love your stories, Julia. They're always incredibly moving, and every time you talk about the Roma, especially, and when you talk about Frederick Douglass and the other people who are in the cemetery or who are in some way memorialized in it.
Yes.
Today, in particular, because we're about to enter into book two, which
Yes.
sorry, like I don't know,
Sorry.
I'm so lachrymose today. But as we're about to enter into book two, um, the thought that's crossed my mind as you're speaking, and forgive me if this is a sort of a tangent, but I recently saw, I think it was on Juneteenth, maybe. Yeah, I think it was on June. No, it was July 4th. Sorry, not Juneteenth. It was July 4th. NPR published a video of some of the descendants of Frederick Douglass, young children. The eldest one was 22 years old, I think, and the youngest was maybe 13, reading the speech that he gave in I think it was 1865, or maybe no, 1862. I can't remember when it was. I think it was before the Emancipation Proclamation. But if I remember the venue, it was to an audience of maybe fellow abolitionists, but all of them, European descendants. And it's a powerful speech in which he doesn't just, offer panegyric to America and to American independence, but he speaks to the injustice of them being able to celebrate independence when so many millions of other Americans are still held in bondage. And these children each were reading some highlighted part of the speech. And as you were speaking, I thought, when you said that thing about the plaque that says Frederick Douglass visited this place, Oh my God, guys, I'm so sorry. I can't stop
No, don't
crying today.
apologize.
But as you were describing this plaque, I thought, we formulate the idea of angels as these incorporeal, ethereal, celestial beings, otherworldly beings, and yet we're constantly surrounded by people who always just challenge us to rise above our complacent selves, right? Who challenge us with ideas like in the case of Frederick Douglass, that justice is not justice if it overlooks a single person,
Hmm.
because the failure of justice for one person is a complete failure
Right.
for all
Hmm.
justice, right? There is no partial justice. It's an absolute. It either is, it's like you can't be a little pregnant or sort of pregnant. You either are or you are not. And I think the same applies to justice. Either a people or a system is just and does champion justice, or they're unjust and they do not champion justice. And so the thought, to conclude, the thought was, these are people like Frederick Douglass, who, when you hear his speeches, oh, there's so much fire in there. There's nothing mortal about that fire. It is celestial fire, right?
Yes.
That is
Yes.
burning in him. When you read his story about where he came from and how he cultivated, I think this is the best word,
Hmm.
cultivated. I don't think rise is the right word because that suggests a hierarchy, right? But cultivation means or
Yes. Hmm.
suggests a robustness, a connection with life and living, and an an uncompromising faith in the potential for life to
Yes.
win,
Hmm.
right? And so every one of Frederick Douglass's speeches, from his most fierce to his most contemplative, and in that group of angels, I place someone like James Baldwin. I mean, you listen to James Baldwin
Yes.
speak,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
I thank God that we have video recordings of him speaking, because his words on the page are powerful indeed. But to watch his face bring those ideas alive as he speaks, it is a degree of inspiration that just takes my breath away. When I listen to Toni Morrison speak,
Yes.
um,
Hmm.
talk about the importance of telling stories that have no voices, when you guys may have noticed it on my Facebook page, especially last year while I was still finishing Rain, I kept repeating that thing that she had said, that if there's a book that you want to read and it has not yet been written, then you must write it, right? And last week, Julia, you talked about the storyteller, the Roma storyteller, who has volumes of stories to tell that reach back into time immemorial and have an incredible breadth of um of culture and memory behind them. And I thought, this it's so wonderful that you're involved in the action, the activity that intends to not only record these stories but also make them available to others to read, because people like that, um they're the ones who show us the possibility of how much more we can reach for, how much more
Yes.
we can reach for. Let me conclude all of this rambling with one of my favorite passages from the Commedia. Now, when I say one of my favorites, you will soon learn that I say that about just about every passage I'm about to quote from the Commedia. It is impossible to pick one and say, "Oh, that's the best one." But this is the one that is pronounced in I believe it's in the Terrace of the Envious.
Yes. Hmm.
No, of the arrogant, of the prideful, the arrogant.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
When if I'm mistaken about that, please, Dante scholars, please don't come after me. I'm pulling this out of memory. Where he says, where he said, I think it's one of the souls that says, like, how is it that human beings do not see that we're born merely worms who have the potential to transform into butterflies? If we had the humility to accept that, then
Yes.
we would let that transformation happen. You know, we would undergo the 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 basically the purging fires, as it were, right, that allow for that transformation. But the arrogant and the complacent presume that the state of
Mm-hmm.
wormliness is the end all and be all, right?
Right.
And
And the
their ability,
blindness. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
so when I look around, not just historically, but at the people around me, every once in a while you get to encounter someone who just gives you a glimpse of just how beautiful the human soul can be, you know, how beautiful a butterfly the human
Mm-hmm.
soul could be. Ah, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I love these conversations, and I know we could talk about absolutely everything under the sun. But will you allow me to segue into our chosen topic for the day? Thank you. Welcome
Yeah.
again, Julia. Welcome again, Karen. And
Welcome.
today we're once again talking about rain. I do not have, and I did not prepare any kind of extra material as I had before, simply because the introductory Zoom cast was just that, a sort of what is this book, how is it laid out, and then the second one was iterating a little bit of that and introducing some of the bigger themes. For this one, I would like to start with just a very quick overview of how book one sort of leads into book two. And this approach was inspired by a conversation I had with Karen the day when we called you, Grace and I,
Oh, yes.
and you had a lot of questions. And so I thought, this is really this kind of this medium, this occasion is a good time for us to maybe revisit some of that. Julia, Karen was wondering about storytelling. She was wondering about traditions, like the traditions of the Luo people, of the people around Lake Victoria. She was wondering about the newness. I think the newness to her as a reader of the lives described in this story. And book two is just full of that. Book two is replete with just the everyday quotidian. There's nothing as dramatic as what happens, say, in book seven, for example. Book two is just sort of like the everyday lives of people in Lake Victoria, and it's set mostly in a pre-colonial uh, s- period. Because it's the same family, you can see the change generation after generation that colonial incursion has. So it works well that book two starts off, or at least reaches back. Let me not starts off, reaches back into that time just before colonial incursion to then take us to the threshold of colonial incursion. So just very quickly, I'm going to time myself and make this 3 minutes if I can, so that we can converse. Book one ended. Book one was essentially structured with first book starting with Maya on the lake, disoriented, right? Trying to make the compass work. She could obviously read it, but she was sure that it was not working. And then that leads us right into Canto 2, where she's slipped into a past that happens to be that moment when Alex disappeared. We find out later that this was that moment where he vanished and she couldn't find him when she was 18 years old. So on the lake, she's 30 years old. In Lisbon, she's 18 years old, and Alex vanishes. I'm going to add some details that I intentionally did not put in Rain. They appear elsewhere. And it is a very, very subtle intertextual allusion to the work of another Kenyan writer who I admire immensely. Maya is born in 1975, and this is part of the function of the timeline, right? If one wants to get into the details of when are things happening, she's born in 1975, and so you notice in her memory of she was 18. Oh no, it wasn't her birthday. It was later, but she was still 18, right? That means that this is 1993 or 1994 when she's in Lisbon, right? So she turns 18 in 1993, and until the next year, she's still 18, right? What happened in 1994? Since you've read the book, I don't mind spoiling for you that this is directly related to what Olóo tells her in the last book about the man of drought and how he invoked this ocean of blood from the people who lived around the lake. What am I referring to? In April 1994, the airplane carrying the Prime Minister of Rwanda was shot down, and Hutu extremists carried out a very brutally organized genocide of the Tutsi of the country of Rwanda. This is the famous Rwanda
Yes.
genocide. It was a slaughter that went on for 100 days, and millions were killed, tortured, raped, dispossessed of their homes. There was a huge emigration by the Hutus once the violence was quelled, and the whole country, there was a huge upheaval. Um, the world looked on in consternation and in shock, and there's still so much confusion surrounding where, how, when, what, of the Rwanda genocide, as it's come to be called. And the intertextual illusion that I'm referring to is a wonderful short story. I'm going to make it available to you if I can find the text, by a Kenyan author named Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor. The name of the short story is Weight of Whispers, in which she dramatizes in a chilling and subjectively immersive way, the a sort of a what's a word? A sort of a keyhole experience of the beginning and the ongoing tensions of this genocide. And she has, since 2003, she has been someone that I admire a great deal, someone that I respect, and whose work is quite wonderful. In fact, I'm going to add some links to some of her other work. She has 2 other novels out, one of which just got published in German translation. But it was in this kind of storytelling that she cultivates, which really draws your entire person into this world and immerses you completely, is one that I found uh, deeply moving and deeply inspiring at the same time. And it was interesting because while I was writing about Alex's disappearance and then having Olóo sort of explain how that disappearance came to be because of all the bloodshed much later, um, I I wondered, like I kept wondering whether, the scribe in me would hear how to make that intertextual relationship clear. It never became clear to me in Rain. I think it's going to become more explicit and more clear in the other volumes in the series to come. Right now I'm writing Wind, and I think it might show up there. But so Alex disappears. So Maya starts out on the lake, and then she goes back to when she was 18. So she's in the past. But then book Canto 3, she comes back to the lake again, right? And she's listening to her grandmother, and she's still disoriented, and she's ruminating about a great deal. And then book 4, she goes back into her past again, but it's a further past. again having to do with Alex when they were children, right? So book 2 was when she was 18 when he disappeared. Book 4 is when they were kids, and he was teaching her how to use compasses, how to use maps, and he was, you know, holding forth in his wisdom, from everything that he had learned from these books. And then book 5 is again with her great grandmother again. Now her great grandmother telling her the story of creation, about how God, Nyasaye Ndolo, touched the river and brought everything forth. And she's just imagining everything that her grandmother is singing about in the lake. But Canto 5 ends with now the Nilotic people emerging from the river, right? And book 6 opens with someone who looks to her like Alex, right? So we've had Alex in 2, 4, and 6, but in 6, it's just someone who looks like Alex, who she then recognizes as a great great grandfather. He looks like Alex in many ways, not just his appearance, but by the fact that he doesn't cast any shadows the way Alex doesn't cast shadows, right? And yes, Karen.
No, and I love the way you had them lock eyes.
Yes.
It was just so psychic. It was right there. And then the question, of course, is, are Maya and Olóo the same? So
The
anyway,
same.
yeah.
No, please. And so book 6, you know, starts with Olóo. And if you remember, it sort of elides into Esther's memory of her family history, because Esther is the one who holds all the memories of the family. So it lies into her memory, and then you get to hear more and more about who these people are, their affliction, et cetera, et cetera. And by the time book 6 ends, and we enter, I'm sorry, book Canto 6 ends and we enter Canto 7, then we're back with Olóo again, right? We're back in the same interaction, like you said, of them locking eyes. And Maya beginning to ask these questions now of like, how is this even possible? What is going on? And now that initial illusion that we'd had to the rest of the family history now focuses more on just Olóo, right? Olóo's history, Olóo's, the moment of his passing, right? The moment of that ultimate dream walk that took his life when his daughter was born. So this is where book 1 ends, and when it segues into, so we have Akoth being born in a rainstorm, the great great grandmother being born in a rainstorm at the end of Canto 1, and Canto 2 begins with Hehra in labor, about to give birth to the twins, and she too um, gets sort of drawn into this mix of family history, of who these people are, and especially of Olóo's life, because she is asking that question: are they the same person? Right? Karen, you anticipated it perfectly. Are Maya and Olóo the same person? And so to me, it was interesting because I was rereading this book. Different people have different favorite books of Rain. A lot of people love book 6 because book 6 is like the love story, right? This is the blood of Anatole Basile Tejo. Like you have all these like beautiful love stories, you know, people walking along the Seine or going to cathedrals together. Which I thoroughly enjoyed writing, and I loved that book too. But I will confess that book 2 is my favorite because it is uh, it is the most peaceful and I feel revelatory one, right? Revelatory not just of the supernatural elements, but particularly of the everyday lives, right? So after we get past Hera's altered state in labor, we enter into Canto 9, which now segues into Akoth's life, right? About her girlhood, with hints of her courtship or Uma sort of like courting her, and with sort of ideas about her own children, because they don't figure very much in the story, but they're important because they're also the ancestors of of our heroes, and And then we have Akoth's encounter with the myth of the great serpent, right? What is this great serpent that her father
Right.
always talked
Yeah.
about? And I want to tell you that this particular myth of the great serpent, it is most famously known in Kenya because of the prophecies of a Maasai elder, um, Olóo, who was very famous for his prophecies, right? Maasais are, that's a different ethnic group than the Luo. But in school, when we learned Kenyan history, we learned this story as one of the Olóo's prophecies when he was warning his people about being too being too lax about welcoming these newcomers. Like he wanted them to be wary of the intentions and even the instruments of the newcomers. So the way the language of prophecy works, it's always symbolic, it's always metaphorical, right? And so the closest metaphor that the Loibon comes up with is that of a serpent that is, you know, sort of streaking its way through the land. And if you take a bird's eye view, this is what a train looks like, right?
Absolutely.
You know, and so you imagine that the Loibon, the prophet, has this bird's eye view of not just the land, but also of time. He has this bird's eye view of time. And to the question that has come up several times, what inspires the idea of dreamwalkers? It is from stories like this. It is from stories of learning about how different medicine healers, medicine men, witches, um, prophets, uh, sort of configured some of their concern about the incursion of European colonizers with their people. Now, obviously, in many, many cases, they were not listened to, right? Or in many cases, there were because incursion, it was also enabled by the participation of locals, right, in the dynamics of it. There were cases where there was sort of violent incursion, certainly, um, but that violence was also sometimes seconded, and often too often seconded, by those who believed that they could benefit from this new circumstance. Um, so this is in terms of where some of these stories come from. Then the story of the serpent is
If I may,
informed. Yes.
when that Maasai who predicted the who came up with the story of the serpent,
Hmm.
when this was a real guy,
Yes, this is a real
when
person
did he live?
in the 1800s.
Oh, okay.
The 1800s, yeah. So it was in and I believe the British themselves come into Kenya at around a little bit after 1885, I would say, after the Berlin Conference, where they come in sort of full court press.
Yeah.
Before that, the most significant sort of foreign agents, if you will, were Arabs from the coastal region, but they didn't go very far inland, right? Um, and so it's one thing that has to be remembered is that all of Africa, including East Africa, was and has always been very cosmopolitan in terms of different peoples from different ethnic groups, tribes, cultures interacting with one another, be it in trade, in marriage, what have you. The kinds of identity divisions that exist today, the sort of tribalistic identity divisions that exist today, are very much like they're the sense of their permanence is very much a byproduct of the system of divide and conquer that served
Right.
colonials very, very well. Because in that story of Olóo's vision of Nyarolango who's getting stoned, right?
Yes.
That's another story that we learn in school when we learn Kenyan history. It's about Luanda Magere, who was a very famous very famous warrior. He would lead all these cattle raids against the Kalenjin, who were a neighboring tribe across the Rift Valley, right? And he was always incredibly successful, right? He was celebrated as the most intrepid and the most, daring of all the cattle raiders, and his status gets elevated to incredibly high, to incredibly great heights. Now, because the Kalenjin were Kalenjin, Nandi Kalenjin, these are groups, ethnic groups that are part of the same sort of cultural context. But the wealth of the Luo, the wealth of the Nandi, the Kalenjin was always in cattle, right? Livestock. And so cattle raids were a way to just sort of, appropriate someone else's wealth without their consent. And the Kalenjin get very upset about this and frustrated because no matter what they did, they couldn't get Luanda Magere, or they couldn't defeat Luanda Magere. It seemed that whenever a spear was thrown at him or an arrow, it just glanced off him like nothing, and they thought that maybe he was made of stone. It turns out Luanda Magere had in fact been protected by very powerful medicine, um, and that the way the and this was from a young age because the Lewis wanted a hero, right? This is a story of Achilles and Samson together, right?
Ah,
You get that sense of, you get the hero who is sort of made by the will of the people and follows through. So Luanda Magere was protected this way. So the Nandi, I keep saying Nandi Kalenjin. Let me say Nandi because I think maybe it is Nandi. And please, my Nandi fans, if please correct me. Go into the comments and correct me. um, uh, they arranged for a marriage, sort of as a peace treaty, to try and get the Luos to sort of to stop to stop invading them so incessantly. And they offered the most beautiful girl as his bride. Her mission was to find out his weakness so that they could finally vanquish him. She marries him, she looks after him. Some time passes, and one day he falls very ill. And the way medicine is delivered, one can say intravenously if you like, but often there's a lot of traditional medicine that's delivered by making incisions in the skin and then rubbing the medicine into the skin so it mixes into the bloodstream. Well, she was given instructions for how to do this once the medicine healer had come to see her husband. But every time she tried to use the razor to cut his skin, the razor would break because his skin was impenetrable. And so she's frustrated, and he directs her because he can see her frustration. He directs, it's like, no, 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 it's not my skin. If you want that medicine to enter my skin, you have to cut my shadow where you want the medicine to go, and then it'll penetrate the skin. And so she tries that, and as she cuts his shadow near his chest, she sees the blood appearing. And so she makes it the two incisions, she rubs the medicine in, and he gets better. By this time, um, one can imagine, at least I imagined as a child, whenever I heard this story, because I both read and heard it, I imagine by this time they had developed at least some level of amity, right? Some level of like spousal love. And so when Yarolango goes back to visit her people at some point and they're asking her, so have you discovered anything yet? As they did every time she came to visit. In this one instance, she's hesitant to say anything because now she knows a secret and they can see that she's hesitant.
yeah.
Yes. And so they insist and they tell her about how this is important for her people and how this was the only reason she was sent to this man. And so eventually she tells them the secret. And now the Nandi decide to raid cattle from the Luo, because now they're feeling, confident. So they launch a raid, and the Joluas are like, and Luo people, we are arrogant. We're very arrogant. We're just like, yeah, whatever, we can handle it. And so they see that the Nandi are coming, and guess what? They're like, "Hey, Luanda Magere, come on, show him what's up," right? So he comes in, all
Come on, bring it, bring it.
exactly, bring it, man, exactly, Karen. And so he's coming forward, and if you see pictures of Luas, especially in the 18th, 19th century, you will see incredibly robust, just beautiful human beings. You just imagine one of those warriors coming forth to rebuff the attack by the Nandis. And the Nandis, they have their war strategy. They're not going to try and fight all the other people. They're supposed to surround Luanda Magere and get his shadow. Problem is, by the time they got to the Luo land, it was high noon. And so the shadow was directly beneath his feet, and they couldn't get close enough, right? So the skirmish went on for so long. It felt like forever, right? And finally, as the sun starts to go down, his shadow starts to elongate. And in one final salvo, a Nandi warrior throws his spear right into Luanda Magere's, the heart of Luanda Magere's shadow, and he fell. And that place where he fell, a huge boulder cropped up. And to this day, when you go to Luoland, you can visit the boulder that Luanda Magere turned into.
Oh my gosh. And then there's the boulder that Olóo's looking at, and he sees the rust stains from the stoning, which was vividly written.
That part of the story is very powerful.
Yes. Yeah, I just, boy, where do people come up with this?
And then also you have on the train, the slaves in the chains. And then you get the blending of the biblical texts with that, the healers, and then on the train when she's reading on her way to Mombasa. And all of these interweavings are extraordinary.
I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. Karen.
I'm just reliving it again. I mean, I started reading it, and again, my mind approaches this book as if I'm seeing it as a movie, and I can just you write it so well that I can see it. Whether we're seeing the same things, I don't know.
That's okay.
But yeah, this is the mark of a really well-written book. A well-written story is it engages all of the senses.
Fantastic. That's wonderful.
That was thank you for that story. I hadn't known that. I have been, and I am not too deep into it yet because it struck me as maybe something more for the winter time, but I did look at YouTube and for Kenyan and African histories. And there are several programs on there that I've already learned something from. The one with the most parts, however, comes from BBC. And I was kind of skeptical as to what perspective they might put on things because I don't know anything comparative.
Yeah.
So if you know of anything you can recommend, that'd be great. But the early history is just fascinating. Just amazing.
Will you send me a link to the BBC program that you saw, and then maybe you can even have a conversation about that, sort of on the side, and do the sort of like thumbs up or thumbs down on different aspects of it to see how we receive that. So shall I go on through the book? All right. As Julia mentioned, there's the echoes of biblical texts, especially from the Psalms, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside the still waters. This is one of the most famous Psalms. I think one of the most widely known. It's the first Psalm that I remember from my childhood. And going back to sort of connecting to book book 1, remember in Canto 4, Maya enters into this sort of theological debate with Alex, and I use the term theological debate very loosely. Because she has a 5-year-old's conception of what God is, that is received knowledge from her teachers, who are in turn dogmatic about it, right? And Alex, being Alex, somebody who just imbibes and just absorbs everything from books, including, and I started this collection. I'm going to show it to you. Yes. So when I was a kid, there we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
This is Tulsidas Ramayana. This is a series called Amar Chitra Katha, sorry, Amar Chitra Katha, which is I think a series of graphically illustrated, and this is
sure.
gods and goddesses, right? Illustrated versions of legends of Hindu Hindu mythology, right? You can see these are all collected, different collections of. There you go. Now you get to get a sense of the different comic books.
Yeah.
When we were kids, you know how kids here exchange baseball cards?
Yeah.
We exchanged volumes of Chitra Katha. Like,
really?
Did you have do you have the latest volume, or do you have a copy of this? Yeah, because in the kiosks they would come out every so often. I can't remember how often. And it was a thing to get the latest story of Krishna or whomever. And so it was a very live part of our lives. And the natural question would be, well, why? There is a very robust and very healthy community of Indian expatriates and their descendants in Kenya, dating back, I think, as far as the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 18th century. Because you will recall that during the 19th centuries, when the British sort of solidified their imperial colonial authority over India, and when they were building the Kenya-Uganda Railway, the majority of workers that they brought in to build that railway were Indian, right? So they brought all these Indians in. Now, there were already Indians especially in the coastal area, because the monsoon winds along the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean made the navigation of these waters a seasonal norm, right? And that was the case for centuries even before the advent of the Europeans. You have evidence of this, for example, in many of the coastal islands that were sultanates, sort of controlled, especially by either Omani or Saudi Arabian sultans of some kind, right? Because they controlled along the entire coast of Africa. They controlled those trade routes. The mix of ethnic and cultural peoples who develop along the coast, including the Kiswahili people, or the Waswahili being a people who emerge from the intersection of Arabic traders and local local residents. And this is something that was just the norm for thousands of years. As you get into, I think, book 7, when we're tracing Vasco da Gama's journey along the coast, right, from Mozambique up to Kilwa and Zanzibar and all that, you have to be able to think as a reader that Vasco da Gama is in Kilwa, threatening to destroy the Great Mosque, right? Threatening to destroy it with cannonballs. And so the Sultan of Kilwa concedes because he doesn't want this great mosque to be destroyed. That great mosque is still standing today, and it dates back to the 12th century. It is, it's really quite remarkable because when I first saw it, it reminded me of the mosque in Cordoba in Spain. I don't know if you've seen the Great Mosque in Cordoba. It's mostly red and really beautiful structure with lots of arches and columns everywhere. So the Great Mosque in Quito is still standing to this day, and it dates from I believe it's the 12th century. Could it be the 13th? The 12th century. And so this is what in the 16th end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, Vasco da Gama is threatening to destroy, right? And so the idea here is that there's this largely cosmopolitan world that already exists before sort of European incursion comes in and decides, okay, this is a tabula rasa, nobody lives here, nobody exists here, this is ours to take, and good luck to the rest of you. So this idea of the theological debate that Maya is having with her brother in book 4 begins to tap a little bit on the sort of pedantic, dogmatic nature of European incursion, not just in military and commercial terms, but even in terms of like religious and cultural terms. The idea, well, this is the truth, this is how it is, and everything else doesn't matter. But because Alex has this sort of wide range to pick from, he does not distinguish a hierarchy of gods or hierarchy of religions or hierarchy of theologies, because he correlates all of that, whether it be the monotheistic religions, whether it be the polytheistic or representational religions that come with here we go, Hindu mythology. He correlates all of that to the stories Mamma Akoth tells of ancestors, right? To him, saints and angels are a parallel, like a different vocabulary for speaking of ancestral spirits. And so,
Julia, I apologize. There was a
please,
lull
please.
here. I'm interested. What do you think of that, Julia? You have a unique perspective.
That's a bit difficult. What I've been finding fascinating in this is how you are putting history into what it's not really a novel. We've been discussing, well, the other night when we did our Dante readings, I got very annoyed because she's a retired professor, and she's very left brain in the way she deals with literature. So she came marching in and insisting on giving the whole commentary. And I've been forbidding the commentaries. I've been saying, no, read the text first, and then we will discuss it.
Yes.
But she was saying, no, we need to know where we are, etc. So she read out all this boring commentary, which is all very left brain and so forth. And I said, but you've left out there that wonderful image at the beginning of Canto 14 in the Paradiso of the ripples of the water which go both in and out.
Yes, yes.
Which is like the human brain, which is outside of time and space. It has the memory of those. And then I talked about Arbak with Odysseus' scar. Do you remember in the Odyssey? The old nurse Euryclea brings a bowl of water to wash this unknown guest's feet. And all of a sudden he realizes that she's going to recognize him by the scar on his leg. So he grabs her by the throat to prevent her from calling out. And the bowl of water crashes to the ground. But all of that is the memory of when he was a boy. And he was gored in the thigh by the tusk of a boar. which is a very Freudian image and so on and so forth. But it's layers of time collapsing. And that's how you're narrating this. And then on Facebook, it was a wonderful essay on essays on Montaigne and Virginia Woolf, and how they're not writing in the way we are taught. And I told them about how when I was teaching at Princeton, and Bob Holland, I was his preceptor, and he was telling them you must write an essay about Montaigne, and doing it in the American style, which is very scholastic from Germany. And I rebelled, and I told the students in my precept, no, write an essay like Montaigne, bring in a foreign language quotation, allow for digressions and so forth. Let your mind play instead of sort of saddling it to time and space in physical terms. And they came back, they were alarmed at first, and they came back, they said, this is the most wonderful thing to do. And that's the way you are writing. It's a book of memory, which is what Dante says in the Vita Nuova, in the book of my memory. And he begins it with the red letters and so forth. And that's what I've been fascinated with this. It's book 2 is a little difficult to figure out all of the different relationships.
Oh yes, thank you.
And if you were
I thought it was just me.
family, perhaps get it straight. I couldn't. But I loved it where the boy Olóo is so abstracting himself. He has this terrible vision of the stoning. But then the healer has him stay with the girls. So
Yes.
there he is with the winnowing of the grain. And it really is beautiful.
And then he just snaps out of it.
Yeah, I'm so glad that she's broken out of the boxes and the shackles, and because I think we've got to get back to that. It's the right brain world, and which is, you also brought in Dante at that point when she's reading the Bible, and you speak about it being both history and prophecy, which is the way he speaks about Psalm 113, the structuring of the Commedia.
Yes. Let me reiterate Karen's question. Can you hear me, Julia? Okay. So let me go back to Karen's question again.
Yes, forgive me, I went off on a digression.
No.
I could listen to you all day.
This is what we're here for, though, Julia.
Exactly.
This is why I love when
now,
you come to
give me the
things.
question again.
The question was, when I was especially looking at Canto 4, where Alex and Maya are going back and forth about God and about theology, and Alex essentially puts on the same level not only the monotheistic deities, but also the polytheistic deities and the representational ones. But he also equates them with the stories that Mamma Akoth tells of the ancestors, so that so saints and angels are simply a different vocabulary for ancestral spirits in the context of Mamma Akoth, a different vocabulary for the different gods and avatars, right, of something like a polytheistic religion. And so I think the question, and Karen, you can correct me or clarify, I think the question Karen was asking is that given your vocation, right, and your dedication as a sister, what is your perspective on all of that debate, and what's your take on and the use of so much Bible? Is that right, Karen?
Forgive me, I'm really a maverick and on the margins. I mean, I live the vows, but the vow of obedience is to the gospel. It's not to a bishop, and it's not to a hierarchy, and also being Quaker as well as Catholic, so I'm a bit of a mixture. I abandoned being Anglican because I fled from trauma, and so forth, and also my children had. But what I loved was my younger son went through an atheist phase, and then he came to me and he said, "Mummy, I think I've got it. You Quakers think of that there is that of God in everyone. God is people." And he was the one who had everybody's kitchen and was feeding the hungry in the streets of New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And I've lost him. I've lost two of my sons.
Oh.
But he really, I mean, he was actually living everything I was sort of dreaming. And bipolar, but absolutely wonderful. And they used to say Jonathan can walk on water. But I think I don't see boundaries. I don't see. So in that way, I'm like Alec, but I don't like Alec's mind. I like Maya's mind much more. Alec is to me, he's too left brain.
Yes, I agree.
They're not having the sense of not being able to see the future.
I agree.
You think that's because maybe he really didn't live a life? He could only,
yeah.
He wasn't in the trenches as far as what we learn from living a daily life in the real time.
Yes. Because
all he knows is what.
Yes, and this is the tricks that you use in your writing. We don't realize at first that Alec is dead.
Yeah,
that comes as a bit of a shock. And also, yes, also Maya has this white gauze on her sleeve, and we don't know why that's there until later with the cat scene and so forth. So you're playing games as well with time, cheating time. What art does. I mean, it cheats time and death.
Yeah, this is interesting. So I'm sorry, Karen, I didn't mean to interrupt. You were going to say something.
No. And I don't want to forget to talk about Mamma Akoth. I'm conscious of the time we have left, and poor Julia, it's what, 10:30 where you are?
Oh my God.
It's 9:30.
Okay. But yeah, this is one of these things where, not being someone of any deep faith, I was raised Lutheran, but I tend to not think there's just one way to believe. And so I'm not sure. I mean, I liked that Alex would put all the deities kind of on an even keel, or see them the same way. At the time, I wasn't aware that Alex wasn't a living being and would see things differently. Thank you for pointing that out to me, Adoyo. But that's one of these. That's the challenging part to me in reading this. Is first, I'm not taking anything all that literally, except for the historical parts that you bring up that we know are verified. But it was just kind of interesting when looking at different cultures. And you now, Hinduism and your little books and your clubs and whatnot, it's like, okay, aren't we all ultimately looking at the same goal? We're what we're taught or what we're told on how to get there might be a little different, but ultimately, in my view, forgive me, sister, if religion is a code of conduct, and there's historical stories behind it, but ultimately, it teaches us how we're supposed to get along in the world with each other. And that's what I like about the way you write this, is that it's not just that way. You're bringing in different ways to do that, and Alex is one of those ways. I mean, there's a different point of view. What I'm seeing bubbling up as I get to know these people more, I guess maybe that's why I like Mamma Akoth so much, is that conscience, maybe. The teacher that we have in different ways. Sometimes Mama's there talking in a melodic, beautiful, watery kind of voice. Other times she's silent, like God can be silent after a prayer. That's your answer. Figure it out. The answer's within you. And I don't know, that's just so rich. I mean, what you've written is so big. There's nothing skinny and simple about it. It's just so rich. I don't know.
This is really remarkable. The shock that people experience with Alex, I think it's not until book 3, right? That I think both you, Karen, and a couple of other people wrote to me. They
Yes.
they wrote out their double takes, right? Because they were doing the one of those, what?
Get whiplash here.
And actually, I can think of 3 specific people, and I want to apologize for whomever hasn't gotten to book 3 yet, who's listening to this, because we're going to have some serious spoilers.
Spoiler alert.
I should have indicated that before, as soon as we started talking about Alex. But what's really interesting to me is one of my other friends, who's a wonderful, wonderful teacher of orature, oral literature, who I hope will one day join us on one of these conversations, and especially for books 5, 6, or 7, and especially 7. But anyway, she's the one I told you was traumatized by book 7, right? And had this sort of like triangulation of signs from so many people about Vasco da Gama. Anyway, she was one of the people who in a conversation, she spoke at length about being completely flabbergasted when she read the passage about Alex. She's like, wait, is that a mistake? Like, maybe that's a typo. And because she's reading about his birth, and she's like, wait, that can't be right. Haven't we been like interacting with him this whole time? What's going on? And then she actually went back to look at every other description of Alex, and she's like, and so I'm looking back and I'm thinking, it was there all along.
That's right. She was reading an e-version and was able to search the text.
Right.
And he didn't have a shadow.
It didn't have a shadow, and the sun went right through him. And there's also the equation of him not having a shadow being just like Olóo not having a shadow, right? And then I think in book 2, even a mention of him when Esther's thinking about him, she thinks about him as the phantom twin, right?
Yes.
Thinking about it's Hehra who's thinking about she's thinking about the different her different siblings, and she thinks about Hera's prodigious memory, and because she sees Olóo in all of her relatives, right?
Yes.
She sees Olóo in Gabriel's laughter. She sees Olóo in Hera's prodigious memory. She sees Olóo in Maya's sort of fixation with Alex, the phantom twin. And then she just goes on like that. So from if you're paying attention, from Esther's perspective, it is Alex the phantom twin, right? And this goes on and on and on like this. And I think even when the kids are playing together, right? There's always the only person who ever interacts with Alex is Maya. The only person who ever listens to Alex or pays attention to him is Maya. And she'll only play with the other kids when Alex is around. But never do you have the other kids addressing Alex or him addressing them in any way, So he'll just be there sort of participating and playing with them, and Maya and then Mamma Akoth are the only people who see him or hear him, right? So it was exciting for me. Again, back to the scribe thing. It was exciting for me to have this sort of the story sort of unspool, right, as I was writing it, and when I get to book 3, which we'll talk about next week, which is essentially the book of conception, right? Like how all the different children were born to Gabriel and Anna. Right? It's the raciest book, I think.
I don't like Anna. Yeah.
but but it's because it's the book of conception, right? The how all the children came to be and were born and all that. The birth or the conception and birth of Alex and David together. As I'm writing it, like I understand who they are and what they are and how they interact with each other. But I kid you not, it was as I was writing the naming, like the moment Olóo speaks up, I'm thinking Olóo is going to speak for Alex because someone already spoke for David, right? Like one of the ancestors, one of the lost ancestors already spoke for David. And then Olóo speaks up, and I'm thinking Olóo is going to speak for Alex, but he doesn't. He just says, "This child, he's not long for this world," right? And Mamma Akoth's reaction to that is to appropriate the fact that Olóo has spoken and then claim Alex, right? Give him a name in that moment. And it's the first big transgression. That's her first big transgression, in that she doesn't just let an ancestor claim Alex. She proxies his claiming, since she uses her father's voice as an excuse for naming him. Karen, you have a question?
What inspired you to have Alex not be a surviving child, or to be not of time?
It's really powerful.
Isn't it? I agree.
Yes. At Princeton, we actually had a freshman who arrived with his imaginary friend.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually had to give them 2 beds.
Wow.
He still had not given up his imaginary friend at university age.
Mm-hmm,
It's a very powerful juxtaposition.
mm-hmm.
Also, the way Alex, he is dead, and his mind clashes with Maya's.
Mm-hmm.
Hers can go further than his. His is limited. And in a sense, you feel that he is the reader criticizing the book, not accepting its structures. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense. Did either one of you get a chance to read Mary Migliozzi's review of Rain? Mary Migliozzi, remember Mary from last week?
Yes.
She wrote a review of Rain, and I don't know if you got a chance to read it. It's I posted a copy of it on the Rain website, and
I must look at it. Yes.
Goodreads. Thank you, by the way, for the review on Goodreads, Karen. I noticed it a couple of days ago. But one of the people who posted on Goodreads is also Mary, and she put a link to her review there. You know, I should put the link to the review in the chat or something. But I think right now I'm multitasking. I'm very wary of like fiddling with things.
Yes.
Like once it's working, you don't want to mess with it, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I will definitely share it later, maybe on my Facebook stream. Then you can click on it. But Mary teaches Italian at Villanova, and so she's very familiar with Dante. And she, in reviewing the book, she was sort of taking into account my own address to the reader, in which I indicate to them that Dante is a very important and significant voice. And also in the afterword, when I talk about how it's Dante's political courage, I guess, to look at history beyond the veil of the sort of a sanitized version that we get, and to speak a truth that may not be a pretty one or a welcome one. So that to me is where the strongest influence of Dante's voice was. It's also in the structure, right? The very sort of meticulous structuring of the story, paying attention to how things correlate with one another within the story, how you have this sense, and I'm sure Karen, you can relate to this sense of reading something and think, wait, have I seen that before? Like, have I heard that before? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
and if you have it in ebook, then you'll be able to look back and go, wait, where did I see that?
Yes, yes.
But it's a I think it's a mark, it's a signature of oral tradition to have
Right.
these
Mm-hmm.
recollections always back to something,
Yes,
something that
yes.
sounds almost identical, but maybe it's a little bit different, and sometimes they're verbatim. They're
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily repetitions, they're just recurrences.
Mm-hmm.
I know, for example, that in Virgil they're very, very common. In Homer, in the Odyssey, the
Yes.
Iliad,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very, very common technique of oral tradition. And then what's really interesting, excuse the excursus, but Dante also uses it, but he uses it extremely economically, like very, very sparingly, so that they're only in all of their commedia, there are only 8 lines that repeat that way. Whereas in Virgil, they're like, I don't know, 900 lines or something,
Yes.
like repetitions everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But in Dante, he's so very economical and very intentional and purposeful with what gets repeated verbatim, right? Anyway, so in Rain, taking all of this tradition, this, and then knowing not just from these literary voices, but also from, like I said, the way my great grandmother told stories, knowing that the natural rhythm of the story is also dependent upon revisiting a recollection as you move forward, and then revisiting it again. Uh, Anyway, so back to, and I lost my thread. I can't believe this. Back to the main thread, which was, please remind me. Remind me of the main thread. I forgot. I'm sorry. I got
Well,
so
that's okay. We've been dancing all over.
yes, yes, yes,
But
yes,
I had
yes.
asked you what inspired you to have Alex as not a living child.
Ah, yes. Okay. So can I even remember what it was? I could probably give you sort of a bird's eye view of what that was, an allegorical reading, if you will, because I think it functions. I think it's clearest as allegory than it is as literal, right? Um, Read allegorically, Maya represents a very robust, living icon of what it is to be born of such a deep rooted tradition and be living in a world that has no knowledge or appreciation of that kind of origin, right? Um, and many things about her indicate this, not just that she's a dream walker, but the elements of being a dream walker, the things that the fact that she perceives things differently, right? um, in addition to her traveling through time in her perception of reality, she's also synesthetic. She tends to see sounds rather than hear them. And when she sees light always comes to her as sound, right? So she will hear light and she will see sound, and that's her, like, her particular um, sensory perceptual. um,
Dante's synesthesia.
yeah, and you know what's really interesting about Dante's synesthesia, which I find so fascinating. Karen, I'll give you just a little bit of context here. Uh, can we go a half hour over just so that we have time? It's
Certainly, yes. Mm-hmm.
now 10 till. Yeah, is that okay? All right.
I would have to leave at 3:30 though.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So we'll be done by then. But I want to give you a little bit of context, Karen, of what we mean when we talk about Dante's synesthesia. When he first starts his journey, he's blocked by all these animals, and and he finds himself like losing hope that he can move forward. And at that moment, when he's describing losing hope, he says,
The
uh,
sun falls silent.
Yeah, so they, oh yes, so they those so my heart was so full of fear, having to face those beasts that were
Without
forcing me
was free.
back into that place where the sun is silent, right? And then he says, in a couple of tercets later, he sees a shadow in front of him, and he says, and then I saw one who from a long, long silence seemed or appeared weak, right? Appeared faded or enfeebled. So first you have him being pushed back into where the sun is silent, and now he sees someone that because of silence rather than because of blurry vision, whatever, seems enfeebled. When he enters into the first when he enters into the first
And this person is Virgil,
this
who
person is
is the
Virgil.
book he is reading.
Yes, yes,
Reading possibly
yes.
silently,
Silently, exactly,
because this is the
exactly.
destruction of the oral culture,
Yes,
is
yes,
the world of
yes,
books, which
yes.
is Alec's world.
There you go. And so
Does
later
that
on,
make sense?
it does make sense. There are a
I
couple of
think Karen is a bit. There's a whole debate in medieval literature
mhm,
about Albert Lord and so forth. They were working with Homer,
mhm,
and they were seeing that, even today in Bulgaria and so forth, the oral storytellers
mhm,
who, if you're illiterate, actually, you're much better at oral storytelling.
mhm.
Uh,
That's
to
true.
enter into the world of books, as Alec does,
Mhm,
is to be crippled.
mhm, mhm,
Our education cripples us,
mhm, mhm.
and
Because it
interesting.
binds you to the very limiting frame of this is what
Hmm.
this is, right? It's a very
Hmm.
analog world. It's
Yes.
not, it's a world that does not leave a lot of space for metaphor, for allegory, for
Hmm.
imagination,
Hmm.
um, because it's a dogmatic
It's
world.
superficial.
It's dogmatic. It's superficial and dogmatic. And
Yes.
so
Hmm.
and so with
Hmm.
Dante, with all these like confusion of senses, here's what's really interesting to me, Julia, because a couple of moments later, significant moments later, you have these mixing of senses or the mixing of the perception of something, either
Right.
by hearing a sound or what have
Hmm.
you,
Hmm.
in deeper sections in hell, right? And
Yes.
here's what my hypothesis about that is. My hypothesis is that Dante is representing a state of unintelligibility, right? Like a sort of
Right.
primal state in which he still can't quite make sense of things
Right.
because he's seeing it at their primordial state. And his mind
Hmm.
hasn't yet gone through the process of arranging it and ordering it in a way that his intellect can make sense of it.
Partly, yes,
Hmm.
but also I love his son's commentary on
Hmm.
Dante,
Hmm.
because he explains right from the start,
Hmm.
this is fiction.
Hmm.
Dante is making this up. It's
Hmm.
not real.
Hmm.
And Dante is entering into the realm of lies, and Satan is the father of lies.
Mhm,
So if you read it superficially with the
mhm,
commentaries like my colleague wrote,
mhm.
you
I
miss
can't wait
that.
to find out who this person is.
But if you go into it with the sense that Dante is deliberately tricking the reader every step of the way,
Mhm,
when you have Ulysses making his speech about you were not born to live as beasts,
mhm,
and you find that that was used by his teacher
mhm,
as a speech, a suicide speech by Catiline, it's
mhm,
the opposite of the way we read
mhm,
it.
mhm, mhm,
And in a sense, practically everything in hell is the opposite. And everyone gets sucked into thinking, oh, the great love story of Paolo and Francesca, and not
mhm,
realizing come corpo morto
mhm,
cade, as a
mhm,
dead body falls as a
mhm,
result
mhm,
of this adultery, which is
mhm,
also against the law of hospitality. I mean,
mhm,
Dante is staying with
mhm,
that family and
mhm,
writing that story. He's a trickster in the way he writes,
mhm,
and if you learn how to understand the tricks
mhm,
that he's
mhm,
playing,
mhm.
then you will be able to distinguish truth from lie.
You know what's really interesting about that kind of framing is that when I think about all the moments when he speaks directly to the reader and says,
Yes.
"Consider, dear reader, think, dear reader, look,
You
dear."
break through the
Well,
frame.
well,
Yes.
here's the thing. He's
Mhm.
giving you all of the clues, like the basically the decoder clues for how
Yes.
to read this text. And he's pretty
Yes.
explicit about it. He's not shy about it. He doesn't equivocate.
Hmm.
When he says things like, look beyond the surface of the
Right.
spectacle in front of you and
Hmm.
consider what it means, where it's coming from, what it
Hmm.
signifies.
Hmm.
Um,
And then he commits perjury when he swears, by this my comedy, with Garyon, with the monster fraud.
Wait,
He's
you
being
have
fraud himself.
why you have to make this case? Why do you say perjury?
I mean, he's doing things that are absolutely outrageous. When you're flying with him on the
Uh-huh.
monster,
Mm-hmm.
Garyon,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who has a scorpion's tail,
Yes.
and he puts Virgil between himself and the scorpion's tail.
Uh-huh.
Now, Virgil is a shadow.
Mm-hmm.
He can't protect
Yes.
Dante from that.
Ah, but, but everything in Inferno and in the afterworld except Dante is a shadow,
That's right.
including
Hmm.
Arion.
Yes. Hmm.
So the Virgil's placing himself between himself and Dante is a protective gesture whose significance is in the gesture itself.
But if you go to his teacher's book on the
Mhm.
bestiary and you look up
Mhm,
the
mhm.
manticore is very like
Yes,
Geryon.
yes, yes, yes.
And he is actually devouring the leg like the boar goring the
Uh.
and the blood is running down the miniature. It's awful.
Julia.
I would have been, seeing that monster and Geryon.
Yeah.
Geryon has the face of a just man.
Yes,
He's
yes, yes,
he's
yes.
the
And yet the
ultimate
body, yes.
hypocrite. You're taken in, and
Mm,
it's extremely dangerous. This is
mm,
before even Leonardo da Vinci is doing his
mm, mm,
flying experiments off Monte
mm,
Cerceri
mm.
and so forth. But you get that wonderful description of flight, which is all made up. It's all
I, I,
fantasy.
I really I want to have a conversation about this with you some more.
I'm
Let me
sorry, I talked
no,
too
no, it's
much
okay.
on
No,
it.
no, no,
No, you
not at
don't.
all, not at all, not at all. I'm just remembering that Karen has to leave in half an hour. And I wanna address your question. Where was the inspiration for Alex? So as allegory, I thought to
Yes.
myself, every one of the characters, because this is a single family with single individuals, you can read their story literally as what happens to them. And a lot of it is that. And this goes back, Julia, to the notion of being able to read a work of fiction in several layers. Because
Mhm.
you have the literal layer, which is the
Yes.
surface of what things are and what they point to, right? In
Mhm.
the surface world. And then you have the metaphorical level. And this is something that Dante put in a letter, Karen, when he was
Mhm.
dedicating the Paradiso. So you also have the metaphorical level where that very same thing that you read literally, you can look beyond its literal meaning to look at the metaphorical
Yes.
significance that it
Mhm.
carries within
Mhm.
the context in which it's presented, right? Because
Mhm.
metaphors always draw out of context.
Yes.
And then metaphors, when they are interlaced and begin to compose the the tapestry of meaning, right, that
Mhm.
you're dwelt with, that enters you into the layer of allegory, so that the entire story is peopled with metaphors that are interacting with it with one another, that are representing other metaphors, etc. So that allegory is the realm of imagination of what could
Mhm.
be, what it could signify, and what, uh, absent the constraints of the physical world, absent the constraints of time, absent the constraints of all those things that tell us that things must be this way. Allegory allows you to explore possibilities and to pose new questions. So, allegorically speaking, the way I see it in my mind now, and I have to reframe your question a little bit rather than what inspired me to make Alex this way. but rather, how do I understand Alex's existence in this
Right.
book? As
I
a
do it with the 4 levels, which is
mm-hmm,
also in the letter de Casa
mm-hmm,
Cangrande.
mm-hmm,
But the 4 levels is the way biblical texts were read,
mm-hmm,
which you can't actually do with a fictional text.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is true.
So what you have, you've got the real Dante,
Mm-hmm,
flesh and blood,
mm-hmm,
who also becomes a figure for you as a
mm-hmm,
kind of everyman figure. So he's
mm-hmm,
both the real Dante, Florentine exile,
mm-hmm,
and he's also every man, every woman.
mm-hmm,
Christine de Bizan will do the same when she does the Chemin de Longitude
mm-hmm,
with the Sibyl as her guide. And so he's the incarnational figure who begins as Adam and will become Christ-like
mm-hmm,
as he learns this moral journey.
mm-hmm.
And then the journey itself is marvelous patchwork quilt. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, he mentions real places,
And
and
real
I love the
people.
Alinari photographs
Mm-hmm,
of those real places that he puts into his dream landscape.
mm-hmm,
As we also in our dreams we play games with real landscapes, mixing them up
mm-hmm,
with what isn't so real and so forth.
mm-hmm,
And then he's got this moral level, but he's also got another level, which is the biblical typology,
mm-hmm,
or what Abba calls figura,
mm-hmm,
where Cato functions as Moses
mm-hmm,
and Virgil as Aaron.
mm-hmm,
And Virgil permits the singing of L'amor nel mente mia ragiona,
mm-hmm,
which is the golden calf.
mm-hmm,
And then Cato comes on the scene as Moses and says,
mm-hmm,
Corre al monte, get up the mountain and stop the, horsing around, and
mm-hmm,
so on and so forth. Because they should have been singing Psalm 113, which is
mm-hmm,
the allegory of the poem, he said. So
mm-hmm,
he's got many different kinds of allegory. The
mm-hmm. And how do you bring that fourth level into rain? Did
Well,
you think it can't be
I
work?
published an article on that, and they
Uh-huh.
said they didn't understand it, but
Uh-huh.
it ended up being what my son said.
Uh-huh.
I see one of the paradigms is of Virgil is Cleophas and Dante is Luke,
Mm-hmm.
and the medieval story of Emmaus 24
Mm-hmm.
of the two pilgrims who meet with a third.
Mm-hmm.
The younger pilgrim is always the gospeler himself, who is told by Christ, "Oh, fool, and slow of heart to believe."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Dante puts himself into the poem as being stupid and
Always.
not understanding what's going
Right, right,
on
right,
and
right,
having
right.
to, and so forth. So he's acting the role of Luke, and he's carrying the book of Virgil's Aeneid, which turns into
Mm-hmm.
Luke's Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you come finally
Mm-hmm.
to the image of God,
Mm-hmm.
mi pare pinte delle nostre figlie,
Mm-hmm.
God seems as if painted in our image.
Mm-hmm.
So I argued that the final allegory really is of meeting that of God in everyone,
Mm-hmm.
which he has in this kaleidoscope of people, because those people are real flesh and blood people who are now dead and
Mm-hmm.
souls, but they were real.
So I want
And
I want to I want to bring it back though to Karen's question because
mhm,
I think she's still pending. I think she's still waiting for an
mhm.
answer. Do you find Alex in any of that, like in the format that you've just elaborated? I stopped at 3 levels because I haven't gotten to the point of the anagogical, right? And if
Hmm.
you just allow
Right.
me to allow me to finish the system that I mean the allegory that I was trying
Hmm.
to lay out to Karen. In this allegory, at this level where the individuals in rain are, the sort of their metaphors interacting with one another, then
Hmm.
Maya represents the living and
Yes. Hmm.
disoriented and unmoored um, uh, child of Africa, right? A
Right.
child
Hmm.
of Lake Victoria. and who is living in a world that does not accommodate her her uniqueness, that does not accommodate her multiplicity, her way of receiving the world, does not accommodate her understanding of it, does not accommodate her conception of what everything means. Alex, in that regard, then represents, because he, like you said, Karen, because he did not even live a single day. He doesn't have any temporal experience with people, with
Right.
history, right? He doesn't. He can't really know what hot and cold feels like because he hasn't experienced it sensorially. He can feel what distress feels like. He knows what distress feels like, what anguish feels like, what joy feels like, because of his empathic connection with Maya. So he can feel those
Through
kinds of,
her.
yeah, he can feel those kinds of experiences, I guess, symbiotically, if you will. And not just through her, she too feels things through him or hears things through him. If you recall, I think it was in book 5, when after the bathtub, right, and she's been washed and now she's falling asleep, and she asks him to tell her a story, the story of the snake people. And he's like, I don't know that story. Now, why doesn't Alex know that story? It's not in any storybook, right? Maya knows the story because she knows the story she's asking for, right? So she's like, tell me that story. No, I want you to tell it. And Mamma Akoth is there, and she takes pity on Alex and starts telling the story. And it is through, and the story sort of gets filtered through Alex before it gets to Maya. So Maya still gets to hear it from Alex, right? And so you have this interrelationship between them where Alex is an allegory of someone who doesn't have an immediate experience of the world that we live in, is entirely dependent on archival
That's
knowledge
right. Yes.
of the world, right? It's not experiential, it's purely archival. And the archive that he most immediately has access to is their father's library,
Right.
full of these Eurocentric, very, because he lived in London for a while, and he was a doctor in training there. So his bibliophile tendencies populates this library with all those things, including all these maps that are quite wonderful and fantastical. So the kids, anything that the kids have access to, including the Amatitra Kapha and all these other things, or everything that Alex absorbs his understanding of the world from, is this archival, very limited notion. And so allegorically, the way I see their, like his, the necessity of Alex being uh, uh, dead. Someone asked me, is he a ghost? I was like, I don't know. Is he a ghost? I think he's an allegory. Like Alex is an allegory,
Yes.
to the
But
extent that.
also, he's. I mean, when I read that part of it, to me, because our English education and
Mhm,
how the boys are sent away to very expensive schools
mhm,
where they are traumatized,
mhm,
they are abused sexually. So
mhm,
when my brother came back
mhm,
from first spyway in Shrewsbury,
mhm,
he wasn't the same
mhm,
child I'd grown up with in the
mhm,
bombing, in the war. Something had gone dead inside him. There he was, this arrogant
mhm,
person who knew Latin and so forth.
mhm, mhm.
But he no longer had this human capacity
Response,
to,
yeah.
no, it was gone.
Oh.
And that's the kind of person Boris Johnson is, and so forth.
And here's what's really interesting that you should say that. It's really fantastic because Alex, being not of this world,
Hmm.
existing out
Hmm.
of time, and yet
Right,
absorbing all this, he's not subject to the to the brutalities that a mortal boy might be subject to, while
right.
also
Hmm.
receiving all of this. Nonetheless, because for me, like again, going back to how I read this, how Alex makes sense to me, I when I look at my own life and I think about the education that I have, that I received, the enjoyment that I derived from
Yes.
receiving that
Hmm.
education, and how rich it was, and how so much of it was from these incredible volumes that I always had access to. I'm the kind of kid who read everything that was in print. It didn't matter what it was. If
Yes,
it was written
right.
down, I was reading it, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
in fact, okay, I will confess, and
Mhm.
Julia, you keep catching me on this. I will confess that the childhood of Anatole Basile Tejo, right? Remember how Anatole Basile Tejo, little Nato, 9-year-old Nato, who loves to read and reads like finds all kinds of ways to like break rules just so that he can read. That was me as a kid. So if it felt vivid reading this child, like trying to find little
Yes.
crannies and like, just vying for a little bit of light, if that felt vivid, it's because it came straight out of memory. Because this
Mhm.
is what it feels like to try and just read that one last chapter before you have,
Yes.
you know. Anyway, having said all of that, when I think about my education, like to me, it is there's so much that is beautiful and rich in it. There's so much that when I look through the lens of that education, and I think this has a lot to do with the way I received my education. I received my education largely from people who had a very, I think, liberal and open conception about what education was. They were not educating me to prepare me for a job,
Right.
to make me
Mhm.
viable for the job market.
Mhm.
They were educating me because there were interesting things out there to learn, right? Because there was something cool to discover about this or that or the other. And I took that and I ran with it, and
Yes.
it wasn't, I will confess that it wasn't until grad school that I actually started thinking about jobs. I mean, I had worked obviously, like high school, I
Yes.
had a job, and when I was an undergrad, I had a job, and because you work, right? But it wasn't until grad school that I started thinking in terms of career, because for me, education had always been about the marvel of discovering ways to see the world, because the world
Yes.
is amazing. I
Mhm.
mean, the world is incredible, and there's an infinity about it, and maybe the infinity is only a measure, or like is only maybe it's only infinite with respect to my capacity to take it in, but that's fine with me. I know I have limited capacity, so every new thing feels like, oh, I did not even know that was possible, and so not discovering something where I'm like, wow, I did not know that was, especially when it's a good experience. Now, I hate it when I come across really terrible experiences, and usually this has to do with the behavior of human beings, right? But most of the time when it has nothing to do with human beings and I'm just watching the world be, right, do its
Yes.
own thing,
Mhm.
I think, like, how is this permutation even like a thing? Like, who would have thought this? Like, how did this come about? And to me, there's so much excitement in every single one of those. And this includes not just the natural world. I love to play the piano. And sometimes I'll sit down with a piece that I'm familiar with, right? And I'll be playing it. And maybe for the first time, I'll hear something in a passage going where I stop and go, whoa, like, how did that happen? How did this composer make this moment possible? And how is it that I never noticed it before? What is the strange alchemy that makes this experience I'm having right now possible? Because it may be a piece that I've played since I was a child, but the noticing of this one moment in that instant makes it brand new all over again. And I'm gobsmacked and I think, oh,
Yes.
I just learned something new. This is
Yes.
what education was for me
Yes.
throughout my
Mhm.
entire
Mhm.
childhood. And it is what it continues to be for me today, not just for myself, but even in the classroom when I'm with students.
Yeah.
I ask students to notice things, right? Not just to imbibe and take in and be able to answer quizzes, but to notice things, to to wonder about things. And I tell them ultimately that the most significant thing they can do as they're learning, as they're covering whatever material we're covering, whether it's language or literature, the most significant thing they can do is generate questions. Find ways to answer questions that are not yes and no questions. Find questions that are like, how come? Why? when did this happen and what is it connected to? Or this is so beautiful. Why does this strike me as so beautiful? Or this is so ugly. Why does this strike me as so ugly? Right? This is so unfair. Why does this strike me as so unfair?
And a little analytical thinking there. That's wonderful.
Exactly. But framing it to them in a very basic terms and saying, hey guys, bring in some questions, right? None of your questions may be about your grades. Don't ask me about how to improve your grade. Ask me how do you get an A in this class? Ask me about, ask questions, not just of me, but of others that require us to notice things that we haven't noticed before. Because there is so much to notice. And the moment we start putting up those walls where we're no longer paying attention, and because we're not paying attention, we decide it doesn't matter. And because we decided that it doesn't matter, then it can't be important. And then because we decided it can't be important, then it doesn't exist. That's when the world begins to become narrower and narrower and narrower.
Excellent point.
You know, um, so I will conclude my response to Karen with this, and we've gone such a circuitous path. I hope, and I'm grateful to you for being so patient about this. In an allegory where Alex represents just learning through archival sources without the experience or the sense of the wondering why, the extent to which Alex wonders why is framed within the content of what he learns from the books. If you remember in book 7, right? Book 7 kind of closes with a reflection on Alex's reception of history, where all he learned besides the dates and the names was to praise and glorify these figures. This is what he received, and so this is what he did. What he didn't learn from these books was the poetry of reading between the lines, of listening to the silences between all of the trumpet calls and, glorious declamations about king this and queen that, et cetera, et cetera. The silence in between where you have the muffled cries and groans of the people that these people stepped on their way to their glory, right? He never learned to hear that, not from the history books, right? Not from these archives, not from these encyclopedias and atlases, because that's not what they were designed to do. And so the way I tie this with my own education is, I I never stop being grateful for having received an education that, on the one hand, was full of these archived materials, but on the other hand, presented it with the kind of freedom of lived experience, right? The ability to,
Yes.
to say, this text, oh, I'll give you an example. Okay, let me give you a concrete example so it's just not abstract. When I finished high school, one of the last things we had to do as seniors was memorize certain passages, right? We memorized the beginning, I think the preamble of the Canterbury Tales, right? You had to sit there in front of your English teacher and be like, Wandera prologisor shora sota, the root of March, terse to the road.
To the road.
Exactly. And then, and a few others, including Hamlet's soliloquy, right? The to be or not to be, that is the question. And of course, when you're in high school, this is a source of deep stress, and everyone is like comparing notes, and it's like a little contest that you're all doing. But there's that day when you have to stand in front of your teacher and deliver your soliloquy. When I was in high school, I did as I was required. I actually enjoyed the Canterbury Tales memorization more than I did the Hamlet, for the simple reason that the Canterbury Tales is just so bawdy and so, I don't know. I guess they appeal to the adolescent sort of like, adolescent thing in me.
Yes.
I grew older and I outgrew Canterbury Tales, but as I grew older, I also appreciated the Hamlet soliloquy more, not just Hamlet, but the Macbeth and all these other different soliloquies. So, but by the time I graduated from high school, I knew Hamlet soliloquy, but begrudgingly. It had been put upon to have to memorize that, and I was happy to discard it But then one day, after I graduated, I was in Washington, D.C. at an ice cream store, which was this great bookstore that's on Connecticut Avenue at DuPont Circle. They had the best ice creams ever, and I'm an ice cream fiend. So I go in there and I'm looking at the menu, and you can see all the samples of ice cream, and everything looks so delicious. And I cannot decide what I want, right? They give you samples so you can try. And so I'm sitting there and I find myself ruminating over which one. I know they give big scoops. Do I just want, I definitely want two different flavors, but which ones? And I'm sitting there ruminating. And I thought, you know what? I need to put a timer on this and just make a decision. Make a decision and just go with whatever decision I have. And I'm thinking, okay, I will count from 10. I was like, no, that doesn't work because then I can slow down. And I don't know where it came from, but I was like, Hamlet's soliloquy. It's perfect because it's a set text. It has a beginning and then at the end. Lose the name of action. Action is like, now you can act, right? When he says, his last line is lose the name of action, right? And I was like, oh, I'll say that one. So I'm sitting there strolling up and down, looking at the flavors, reciting under my breath, to be or not to be? That is the question. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, with thick arms against a sea of troubles, and by a pleasant emblem, to die, to sleep, no more. So I'm going on like this, right? Up and down, up, just strolling, taking my time. And then I get to and lose the name of action. It's like, oh, I have to choose now. I had no choice. So I think I ended up getting something like a Rocky Road and vanilla or something. So I don't remember the asking flavor, but I'm sitting there licking my ice cream and I'm thinking, oh, wow, this, if anything, is the ultimate decision soliloquy, right? Hamlet is contemplating the biggest decision of his life, like the biggest decision anybody can ever make, based on like the biggest verb that anybody can ever, like, to be or not to be. And it's amazing because while he's thinking of metaphysical things and he's thinking about politics and he's thinking about, his soul, and then we can talk about his psychology and his indecisiveness as a teenager, and we can talk about all kinds. While he's doing all that, William Shakespeare wrote a soliloquy that I can use anytime I have to make a decision because it puts my brain in that consider, weigh your options mode, right? And then by the time you get to the end, make that decision, knowing that you've ruminated enough rather than going endlessly back and forth, never acting like Hamlet, who never acted until it was too late, right? And so I was sitting there with my ice cream and I started giggling like a fool. People must have thought I was crazy because I thought to myself, I was so resentful to my English teacher for making me memorize this. Little did I know it would serve me so well when I needed to make a decision about what ice cream to get. So having that kind of education and whoever watches this, I highly recommend using Hamlet's soliloquy in any decision making process. So this is where these two, what Alex and Maya mean to me. And I think Maya is the other extreme. Allegorically, Maya is the extreme of having no guidance, at least no meaningful no meaningful structured guidance. Her trauma in book 4, right, when Rosie ran away, I think is I think the physical really gets you. Like the physical is quite powerful. This physical trauma with the cat, and then also followed up by with her mother. But I think more significant is the psychological trauma of betrayal by her mother and her grandmother, right? Compounded by David, so that this child is left completely bereft and entirely alone. And so imagining like the sort of the modern African child today, when I think about that, I think all this potential, all this beauty, all this possibility and depth of experience and history and culture left bereft, betrayed by kith and kin, because the dynamics of empathy within a closed, intimate circle are just atomized. Now, this is not a generalization. This is simply an allegory. This is not a generalization about the state of, but rather taking that allegory. And when I look at whether it be my life or my countrymen or my fellow Africans, and I look at what heads of state do to the nations. When I look at those who are put in positions of authority, what they do to their peoples, it's at that level, at that bird's eye level, it's so easy to see them perpetrate this kind of betrayal and abuse, betrayal and violence over and over and over again. Physical violence, psychological violence, economic violence, and exploitation over and over and over again. The one person or the figures that people depend upon, right? Not only to to curate their resources, but also to use those resources in their cultivation. I know I've skipped over to book 4, but the way Anna very sweetly coaxes Maya out and then immediately turns on her, right? It's not to be too on the nose about this. All of these supposed leaders who sweet talk constituents, and as soon as they're in the position where they have you where they want you, boom, flipped around, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. And the enabling of fellow constituents, the enabling of your siblings, the all that sort of thing. So to finish in the last 3 minutes left, which I want to concede to you, Karen, before you go, this is how I see Alex, especially in relation to Maya, as allegories. So, Karen, it's yours.
We're going to have a session sometime. Perhaps Julia would agree that it's just, how the hell did you even come up with any of this? I mean, what were you doing, girl? Were you walking down the street and said, I'm going to write this really? I mean, how do you come up with it? And I really want to know. I want to know that sometime. And it's just, I'm thinking this book is like baklava. It's just layers, layers, but not all of them are sweet. And I want to know. I think I want to know what's in your head.
I want to go back to the opening of book 2.
Oh, yeah.
She is in labor.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember we had put together a lovely edition in Italian of Casa Guidi Windows. Mm-hmm. And we got to read it in Casa Guidi, mm-hmm. with the church bell beginning to ring at exactly the right time. Mm-hmm. We really had goosebumps. But this was a documentary that Elizabeth Barrett Browning was writing about the birth of the Italian nation at the Risorgimento, mm-hmm. which she witnesses. Mm-hmm. She sees the Austrian army coming down her street and so forth. And in between the two books, mm-hmm. she gives birth to her own child. Mm-hmm. And she also describes Anita Garibaldi fleeing and dying in childbirth and being buried in the sand and the dogs digging her up. Mm-hmm. And there I was realizing as I was reading this, mm-hmm. I've been such an academic that although I've given birth to 3 sons, mm-hmm. I don't think of myself really as having a woman's body. Mm. I've sort of been trained in this Alec world of always being the intellectual and amongst the books. Mm-hmm. And I was so valuing Elizabeth, who, she was a cripple, etc., in a very abusive marriage, actually. Mm-hmm. But having the courage to speak about poetry as being born from a woman's body. Mm-hmm. And it was quite an overpowering moment. And I was getting that in
Mhm.
book 2, which will again be the ending when she gives birth to the twins.
Mhm.
And it is very, very powerful and empowering that you have done that. Thank you. And it's a world that Alec can't share.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Karen, I wonder, what did you think about all the scenes that have to do with childbirth and
Uh,
pregnancy?
about what?
Okay. No, it's asking Karen, since Karen is also a mother, what did you think about the representations of pregnancy and childbirth and
With oh, it's really sad with the mother,
mm,
Maya's mother,
mm,
who ends up being married to the man she's not attracted to.
uh-huh.
Okay, is it time to end?
Yes,
I need to go. I just,
Right.
wonderful. Thank you so much for the
Karen, Karen,
experience.
Thank
thank you
you.
so much. So we'll see you next week and we'll continue.
I'm afraid that one won't be because my friend who has a vintage shop
Mhm.
needs some help in the shop that day. So I will be actually working
Oh, wow.
next Saturday.
Okay. Okay.
And so I won't be able to join you, but I will certainly be looking at the recording.
Okay. And if you come the week after that, that's when we get into a lot of the violence. So just prepare yourself, brace yourself.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you
Good
so
to see you.
much. Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much, Karen. Thank you. Bye. Okay.
Right.
So you're saying, Julia, please.
Mhm. I love the book.
Mm. I'm so glad.
And
I'm so glad. That's
and
really, that's really wonderful.
it's especially the the playfulness with all of these different modes of thought that go
Mm-hmm,
into it,
hmm hmm
and the courage and the daring, the truthfulness, which is what also Dante is doing by playing games with lies. He's teaching the truth,
hmm
and
hmm
playing fictional games, he's arriving at the goal,
hmm
which is to see God face to face in our own image, which is very much the Greek Orthodox theology of deification. Of Jonathan used to wear a T-shirt saying, "Every person is a holy place."
That's,
And
I love that. That's beautiful.
uh,
That sounds very Franciscan, very San Francesco d'Assisi.
yes,
Yeah?
mhm.
Laudatissimi Signor con tutte le tue
And
creature.
that's what Dante is doing. He's putting
Mhm.
Franciscan Laude throughout the Commedia.
I agree. I agree.
Yes.
I agree 100%. I I'm I'm still very much fascinated with, okay, so this is going to bring me into contemporary events, right? Contemporary, like current events.
Mhm.
When when I think in 2016, when Colin Kaepernick
Mhm.
lost his job
Yes. Mhm.
because he refused to cease and desist from
Mhm.
kneeling
Mhm.
when the national anthem was being played, because his kneeling signified um, a silent protest against
Right.
the
Injustice.
injustice, exactly,
Mhm.
against
Mhm.
injustice, and
And he
and
was
and
met with injustice.
and he was met with injustice. He was met with derision. He was met with indignation
Mhm.
and persecution. Um,
Yes.
and it's a couple of things came to mind right away.
Mhm.
The first was in Canto for Paradiso, when Beatrice is talking about absolute and relative free will, right?
Mhm.
And she brings up the example of what what kind like what is the nature of free will when one is acting under duress, right?
Mhm.
Or under some kind of threat of loss or what have you. And her conclusion at the end of her argument was something to the effect of, well, the conclusion being that for 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 a will that is pure, then no price, nothing is too high a price to pay for the integrity of
Right.
one's principles.
Yes.
And he ends with this adage: "Why do you think there are so few martyrs?" Right? Why do you imagine that there are so few martyrs? Because at the end of the day, there are degrees to which people will accept loss or suffering, and then there comes a threshold beyond which they are no longer able to tolerate or willing to tolerate the loss or the suffering. And the martyrs are the ones for whom that threshold is absolute. It's where they won't compromise, no matter what the threat, no matter what the degree of suffering. And I thought about this discourse that Beatrice unfolds a great deal following Colin Kaepernick's news, because I thought to myself, this is a man who he's losing all of this public acclaim and adoration. He's losing his livelihood. He's losing like the public is, especially the most vocal public, is so you know, feels so righteously indignant about what he's doing, and they're not paying attention to why he's doing it. They
Right.
refuse to listen to why he's doing it, because they're so busy being taking umbrage that he even dares to bring up anything else while they're supposed to be going through this ritual. The next thing that I thought about was Virgil's encounter with Catone in Purgatorio, when Virgil, when he's trying to introduce Dante to Catone, or explain who Catone is, he does this little like charming captatio benevolentia about how, about Catone's wife and how she must be, et cetera, et cetera. And Cantone sort of paws all of that away. But the idea is that when he's being introduced, Virgil says, like, this one seeks liberty, and that must, and you surely must understand or be able to empathize with that, you who are willing to give your life for the sake of liberty, right? And so I thought about Colin Kaepernick then too, and I thought, wow, this is incredible, because we are so conditioned to believe that safety and security have to do with financial stability. And yet here's a man who, in demonstrating for the cause of justice, is putting all of that on the line, and he knows he's putting it on the line, right?
Yes.
And not only is he putting that on the line for himself, it's almost as if in doing so, so consistently without wavering,
Yes.
he essentially also calls into question the validity of the idea that security equals financial security, right? He calls into question the entire capitalist system,
Right.
because he
Right.
says there's something that matters more than financial stability or
Yes.
popular
Yes.
acclaim. All the things which in today's economy are considered the most thing, like to be rich and popular are the thing of our culture today, right? And Kaepernick was willing to lose all of that and lost all of that, so that his protest not only sustains the principle, but it also calls into question the very premise underscoring like our conception of what stability is, about what safety
Right.
is, about what security is. And so so today, as I, every time I read the Commedia, and I still read it every day, there are moments in the text that have me thinking, like, how is it that, how are these people who can see so far beyond our basic like conditioning about what we think we need, about what we think is necessary. Like, how do they get to the place where they can see that and act in a way that renders all these supposedly important things moot, that demonstrate the futility of all these concerns? Like, how do they get to that place? And I think Kaepernick especially is an interesting, like, obvious national public case, because there was, while there are people who debate and it's like, well, yeah, what he's doing is, it's meaningful and his cause is meaningful. There was never the kind of public acclaim or like just that sweep of, you go, Colin. If there was, it was silent, it was quiet, maybe private. It was nowhere near as clamorous as the critique. It is nowhere near as devastatingly consequential as the denial of life and of livelihood. It was nowhere near as alienating as people thinking that, well, he's certainly, labeling him, he's not a patriot, he's this, he's that, and or dismissing what he was saying by saying, well, he certainly has enough money and he can afford to do that because, and I thought, no, there's something different about this person. There's absolutely something different about this person. And the interesting thing about this is that he didn't say very much. It was just the action. He has made speeches, but he's not prolix. He's not a speech giver. I think there's one instance where he says thank you when he was awarded recognition at Sanders Theater, and he makes a brief speech. But even that, I couldn't hear the rest of it because of like copyright issues made the rest of it unavailable. But I still think to myself that the most significant way in which he has communicated these principles that are outlined and dramatized in the Commedia about justice was just through very simple action that brought with it huge consequences.
And well, the Commedia is such a debate for Dante himself. I think when he talks about the man who makes his house a gibbet, he's talking possibly about himself, the disaster of being exiled. Because when you were exiled in the Middle Ages, you were also excommunicated. And there he is outside of the sacraments, writing this great work of lay theology, where he tackles so many things. But he gives you the suicide of Pierre de la Vigne, who's so sorry for himself, bashing his head against the wall and so forth. Great poet and a great lawyer, and then he gives you Romeo, who is accused through jealousy of what he hasn't done, like Pierre de la Vigne. And he simply asks for a donkey and his staff and goes off on pilgrimage. And that's what Dante does in taking off. And we've made a facsimile of the Libro del Chiodo, in which Dante has made two of them. My Roma restorer did the metalwork. He's a wonderful blacksmith, has his grandfather's tools. And when Nicolai was Bandita da Firenze, who was exiled from Florence, we actually took a photograph of both of us laughing with him holding the Libro del Chiodo, and he was able to come back after 3 years.
Where was he banned? Where was he exiled from?
But he was exiled because of insufficient reddito, of insufficient income.
Are you serious?
Yes, this materialism and so forth, because he begs. But he's an excellent gardener.
Capitalism is such a bane.
And I go to court with him and I show what the cemetery was like before his work, what it is like now. And the judges always let him off. But we have to go to court. Every courtroom in Italy says above the judges, the law is equal for everyone, and it's not. And I think this is the scandal that we're living with everywhere, in Italy, in England, in America, that we see these false differences and put people into categories, which is very left brain. And it's much better to see us as like down to every man, every woman, as universal. But then all the riches of each different culture as well. And this, what I say to the Roma is, learn our culture, but never give up yours. Keep yours. With two cultures, you're richer. It's not a poverty.
I agree. I wish people here could learn that and appreciate that too. You know?
You know, it's my pumpkin hour was almost 2 hours ago. I get up at 4.
Okay, so I need to let you go then. Thank you so much, Julia.
I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for this book.
Oh, this is wonderful. I'm so grateful every time we talk, because it enlivens more of my I've been reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning lately, because it's our conversation
Blow all class walls level as Jericho's.
the conversations with you has quickened my curiosity, and now I want to read more. And do I have it here? I received this in the mail. Let me show you. Received this in the mail. It arrived.
Good. Yes.
Thank
Good.
you.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
So shall we continue?
And get the Penguin edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
Okay.
I edited it, and
Okay.
she really is. Robert was jealous of her, so he was publishing her worst poems, and he did her reputation in. So we have this image of her as this sick room sentimental invalid. She's the exact opposite of that. And we're now translating her poetry into Italian, because the Italians know her story, but they don't know her poetry. And I have a colleague at the University of Verona who is doing a beautiful job with editing it with me.
That's wonderful.
Because we do need women's voices.
We do. I agree 100%. So shall we continue our conversation next week?
Thank you very much.
This is like I said, with the book of conception. And thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful week, and we'll continue. Okay.
Yes.
Bye.
Good night.
Okay. Okay. I think I need to stop it right here.